One of the keys to insomnia is when you spend enough time frustrated and awake in bed, your brain starts to associate bed with being the place where you go to be awake and frustrated. This is something called conditioned arousal, and it's why people will often experience being drowsy and dozing off on the couch. And then the second you go to bed, you're suddenly all revved up and wide awake and you can't sleep. It's likely because of conditioned arousal. You have spent so much time awake in bed that your brain has this autopilot feature, and your brain has learned that bed is a stressful place where we need to be alert. So instead of cueing your sleep response, your brain is cueing your fight or flight response. So by retraining your brain that this constructive worry time is where we do this kind of processing, your brain starts to learn, oh, this is where we worry and think about all of this stuff, not when my head hits the pillow.
Welcome to Successful with ADHD. I'm Brooke Schnittman. Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Successful with ADHD. Today, I have ADHD sleep fix, 3-time Emmy Award-winning journalist and ABC News anchor, Diane Macedo. And I'm going to definitely get more into her bio. She has a very long history of accomplishments that are worthy of noting. But today, what we're interested in diving deep into is her recent ADHD diagnosis and her sleep fix method that helps practical, proven, surprising solutions for insomnia, snoring, shift work, and more. And I know that we hear so much about the complexity of ADHD and how sleep is impacted by our ADHD symptoms and vice versa. So without further ado, very warm welcome to Diane. Appreciate you being on.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. And just a little bit more about her. She's currently the morning anchor for ABC News Live, ABC News 24/7 streaming news channel, and she's also anchoring the Emmy Award-winning show ABC News Live First. She's a breaking news anchor and correspondent for ABC News, appearing on Good Morning America, World News Tonight, Nightline, World News Now, and America This Morning. And she also wrote a book on her sleep fix method. She's a best-selling author. And she went public, as I mentioned, with her ADHD diagnosis, and she is in an ongoing series about the Inside ADHD, where she goes behind the scenes with real people talking about their stories on navigating life with ADHD, and also doctors and professionals and their perspective as well. She also graduated from Boston College with a double major in communications and political science, and can speak multiple languages, English, Portuguese, Spanish, and she lives in New York City with her husband and 2 children. Okay. Now I'm done. Take a sip.
Say all of it, but thank you.
So I asked Diane to be on our show because she's went public, and it's so important that ADHD awareness gets out there. And we know since 2020 that a lot more people have been able to recognize more symptoms of their mental health from the pandemic and understanding more about themselves, and people coming out on social media. But it's really important that public figures come out too and can normalize a lot of what other people with ADHD are feeling. So Diane, you struck a chord with me. I know that you had recently come out with a video on your Instagram about how you were able to manage a lot of your symptoms before becoming a mom.
Now that I look back, I realize they were there, but they weren't interfering with my life in such a dramatic way. So it was always hard for me to keep track of appointments, but it was easy for me, if I realized at the last minute, to just run out the door and still make it, if a little bit late, still enough to make the appointment or whatnot. When you have 2 kids at home, you can't do that, right? You need to plan ahead for things. It's harder to recover if something falls through the cracks. And if I forgot something, then I forgot something. I was always annoyed with myself over these things, but I had more bandwidth to deal with them. I remember when I went on maternity leave right after I had my son, and I just felt like I was in a fog, and I felt so overloaded trying to remember. I remember I was making formula. I tried desperately to breastfeed, and I beat myself up over that because I had all these complications and I couldn't do it. And then amidst of feeling all that guilt, I was, making formula while also thinking about the other million things that one has to think about when you're a new mom and balancing all of the needs of a newborn. And the number of times I went to make these formula bottles and realized that I had no idea how many scoops I'd put in. And for those who haven't been there, formula has to be exact. One scoop too many, one scoop too few, and you can have really serious repercussions on the baby. So this isn't something where you can say, meh, if I didn't know how many scoops of iced tea mix I put in my water, that wouldn't matter. It'll be a little sweet or it'll be a little weak. No big deal. But this had serious medical. So the number of formula bottles I had to throw away, and formula is so expensive, by the way, for anyone who's never had to buy it.
And the
Because I
shortage.
just,
Let's talk about
and I would
that.
say, okay, stop, pay attention. You're scooping the formula. Stop thinking about anything else. And even then, sometimes I couldn't stay focused enough on the scoops. My mind would go to something else that I would worry about. And the next thing I would look down and say, oh, how many scoops did I put in? So between that and trying to remember which doctor's appointment comes when, and all the micro decisions that I was taking really seriously and trying to figure out, what we had to do and when we had to do it and whatnot. It all which felt like the world was crumbling down on me, and trying to maintain a neat house, which is really important to me. And it also really difficult for me and has been since I was a kid. My bedroom always looked like a tornado, even though I really wanted it to be neat and clean. And now that I was home all the time, it felt like my house was the same at a time when I wanted so badly to be the perfect mother and to have this beautiful, neat, kept home for my beautiful baby to be able to bask in. And instead, I just felt like everything around me was on fire. All I saw was all these tasks that I hadn't yet done and all of these things I was trying to balance in my head. And yeah, it just was incredibly overwhelming to me. And at the time, I just thought, this is what maternity leave is like. This is what it's like to care for a newborn. How many new moms talk about how difficult that stage is? And now when I look back, I say, oh, that was, just
ADHD.
a peak manifestation of my ADHD. And one of the coping mechanisms that I was referring to when I had that moment in the psychologist's office is I realize now that my brain has learned that I will forget. And so I have compensated for that by just doing things right away. So if I'm in the middle of a room and I see that there is this cup that, oh yeah, I need to refill my water cup, I have learned, let me just go do that right now. I don't consciously think about that, but I think I've just learned, let me do that right now and I'll forget. But then when I get to the kitchen and I go to refill the water cup, when I get to the kitchen, I see something else that I left out on the counter that needs to be done. And so I'll grab that thing and go to fill out that document that I still have to fill out and mail. But then when I go to get the stamp to mail it, I'll see something else that needs to be done, and so on. And I'm chasing my tail all day. And I think when I was single and only had myself to worry about, I could do that. I could just do the thing right away. And sometimes, or most of the time, do it to completion and then be reminded of something else and move on that way and sort of just freewheel it that way. But now, not only does my brain interrupt itself, but I have two children who are constantly interrupting me, and a husband. And this is not to bash my husband because he's wonderful and a very active parent and a very active partner. But it's just natural when you have multiple people in a household who all use the same stuff. They are constantly interrupting you, saying either, look at this, or listen to this thing that happened to me, or what do you want to do about X, or where is the blank?
Yes.
And like many women, I am generally the one in my house who is in charge of where everything goes and is at all times. And so I think that's where my coping mechanisms really started to break down, because I no longer just had to manage my brain's own natural interruptions because it's always going in multiple directions at the same time. But now I have other people also interrupting me during that process. And that became too much for me to handle and continue to feel like I was thriving.
Yeah. I think that's so common with an adult ADHD diagnosis, especially for a woman, being able to just, strap on your boots and do it. And now you're the frontal lobe for literally your entire family, right?
Mm.
Like you're taking on this huge load. It became too much. And the shame is 100% real. And I think that it's just so much that we take on as women to begin with. Like you said, oh, is this just being a mom or is this also having ADHD?
I think that was the hard part for me because I was reading so much stuff about what it's like to be a new mom and the disproportionate distribution of labor among households. And that really resonated with me. And I realized I was managing way too much and doing all this invisible labor, and I was able, thankfully, through some great reading materials like the book Fair Play, like the comic You Would Have Asked, relay it to my husband and explain to him things that I hadn't even realized. Listen, when you reach for the diaper and you change our baby's diaper and you think, what a great job I did changing a diaper. That's great. But what you don't realize is the reason you can just reach your right hand right down and grab a diaper is
Because you
because
put it there.
I put them there. I am constantly keeping track of when we are low on diapers. And then when I was setting up the room, I decided the diaper should go there because this is where we're going to change the baby. And so that's where the diaper should be. And then when you go to grab a wipe, the reason they are right next to the diaper is very easy to grab. Same thing, because I'm constantly replacing them and I decided thoughtfully that they should go there. And same for all of the other diaper supplies. Same for when you go to dress them for bedtime and whatnot. All of these things, every object in our home is there because of the thought that I put into it. And, we have this conversation a lot and had it a lot. And thankfully he gets it and got it. And we made adjustments in our household because of it. But these were things that I didn't even realize. And so I just thought I'm having all these experiences because I'm juggling the massive responsibility that is being a new mother. And that just comes with a lot of cognitive tasks. And I'm trying to do too much. And so it wasn't even on my radar that I could possibly have ADHD. And as it turns out, what I was experiencing was a combination of those two things. And the only reason I was finally able to have that light bulb moment of, wait, this is ADHD, was one, Instagram. I started scrolling reels because I had released my book, The Sleep Fix. And so I wanted to start posting more about it to get the message out of what I was trying to convey in terms of how to fix your sleep. And in the process, I started getting served more and more videos about adult ADHD. And they all resonated and I all found them really funny. But again, I just thought, well, everyone's brain works this way. And then eventually I started seeing things that resonated with me that I had never heard anybody talk about before, like time blindness. And the light bulb went off. But the other part of it, and I don't think I've talked about this publicly yet, is that my husband and I had implemented changes in our household to try to address that uneven distribution of labor in our house. And up until that point, it was so easy for me to just dismiss everything that I was feeling as, well, of course I'm drowning. Of course I always feel overwhelmed. Of course I have trouble focusing. I am doing everything. And then once we kind of split things up differently and he took over, a good portion of the household labor, not only the physical tasks, but also the mental tasks of actually executing on those things and managing them and the conception of them and so on, it created more space and more bandwidth for me. And so once that happened, and then I realized I was still experiencing all of these symptoms and started thinking about how I'd had them since childhood, that allowed me to connect the dots. But I genuinely think if we hadn't sorted out that part of the equation, the fact that I was managing everything in my household, I don't think I ever would have discovered that I had ADHD because all of my symptoms could have been explained by just the overwhelming responsibility that I was carrying at the time.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And I want to recognize the fact that so many people, are drowning as a mom. So for you to be able to delegate in that moment and ask for your partner's help and him take that load on, right? Take part of that load on, it cleared up the space for you to even start thinking about what is this? Like, let me figure this out.
And to be clear, that was a months, if not years long process. It wasn't like we had one conversation and he just said, oh, I totally get it. All right, well, then give me a new, not even give me a new list because that wouldn't help. But, it was an ongoing process for both of us. But thankfully we got there and it was probably, I don't know, a good 2 years into that, if not more, that then I started thinking, I think I might have ADHD, and kind of going down that until finally I got a diagnosis.
Yeah, no, being interdependent between two people is really hard, right? We're independent, like you have a very independent job. He probably has a very independent life, and then mixing the two together is takes work. So I appreciate you sharing that. So you got the diagnosis and you became aware that this in fact is ADHD. So now that you have that awareness, what's changed for you?
So much. So I first got diagnosed 2 years ago, by a nurse practitioner who I found on ZocDoc. I mean, I've sort of been diagnosed 3 times now. This all came about because
You
my
didn't
best
believe the first two?
well, so no, I did. But my one of my best and closest friends is a psychologist based in California. And so she came to visit me when I started having this, light bulb moment via Instagram. And so in a conversation with her, I just randomly said, "Oh yeah, I've been meaning to also signature ADHD." I interrupted her in the middle of something completely unrelated to say, "Oh yeah, I've been meaning to ask you, and I keep forgetting. Do I have ADHD?" And so she just said, "What?" And so I explained to her why I was asking the question. And so she started asking me a series of questions. Long story short, at the end of that conversation, she said it really does sound like ADHD. And she explained all the different ways that it can be misdiagnosed and confused for other things. But based on all the follow ups and all the different parameters, she said, no, it definitely sounds like ADHD. So literally the next day, I made an appointment for an evaluation. And thankfully at that time, I was able to get one pretty quickly. And so I was kind of informally diagnosed by her, formally diagnosed a few days later. And that was where this process started. And so, for anyone who watched the first installment of my series, Inside ADHD, and the piece that I did for Good Morning America, what you saw on camera was a confirmation, because I wanted to make sure that this diagnosis is right, because there's so many people who call it into question, that I wanted to be 100% sure that this diagnosis is correct before I go out and start talking publicly about what it's like with ADHD. So I wanted to just dot my I's and cross my T's. And so we went to the Hallowell Center, which is one of the most renowned clinics probably in the world for ADHD. And that was where I got evaluated and diagnosed on camera. And she confirmed that I am absolutely ADHD. I was 91 percentile for inattentive symptoms and borderline for hyperactivity symptoms. So I combined type ADHD, but mostly inattentive. So 2 years ago, after getting that diagnosis, was a light bulb moment for both me and my husband, because it was able to explain so many things that I had done. So for me, it was huge because I was able to look back all the way to childhood and suddenly forgive myself for stuff that I had attributed to lack of effort, moral failing. And this is the part that I try to explain to people. If you have trouble seeing, trouble reading, trouble running, people assume you need help. But if you frequently forget to return items, people think you're inconsiderate. If you forget to do certain tasks, people think you're lazy. If you have trouble keeping your room clean, people think you're a slob. And there's just all these negative connotations that come with the difficulties that come with ADHD, or at least the form of it that I have. And so I think, formed all of these immediate negative self-talk reactions to certain things. The amount of times throughout a day I started recognizing that I chastise myself for things. "Oh, you idiot. Oh, why'd you do?" And I started realizing, one, the negative repercussions that was having without me realizing.
Mhm.
And yeah, I started forgiving myself for things. I learned to give myself more grace. And I think more than anything, I learned to start troubleshooting, because for me, it's, the gift is the curse. I have this brain that is an ideas factory. You need troubleshooting, I'm your girl. The problem is my brain is so good at that when it comes time to execute on boring tasks, or what I consider to be boring, my brain's still busy spitting out new and great ideas. And so
Mhm.
the ability to finish a task while you're also listening to your brain screaming at you that you should be doing this other great idea is the hard part. But in getting this diagnosis, I was able to turn that around, because now that I knew what the problem was, my brain immediately went into problem solving mode. So, for example, I would let vegetables go bad in the fridge all the time. Vegetables, leftovers, whatever. Anything that can spoil would
Mm-hmm.
spoil in my fridge. And I'm someone who loves to cook. So this was really frustrating for me because I do a lot of grocery shopping. I love a fridge full of food. I love to cook. And so to do all that and put in all that effort and then realize that you forgot about that thing in the back of the fridge again or in the drawer and it's spoiled, it's awful. So I realized that the reason I was forgetting was because I couldn't see the things, and people with ADHD often have object permanence. So out of sight, out of
Mm-hmm.
mind. And so I thought, okay, well, how do I fix this? And then I saw I think it was a TikTok video from Casey Davis. I think
Mm-hmm.
her handle is
Mm-hmm.
Domestic Blisters on TikTok. And she said that she started putting her produce in the door and her
Mm-hmm.
condiments in the drawer. And I thought, yes, but I needed to step it up a notch. And so I bought these glass containers, like a Gladware, plasticware type thing, only they're glass because I prefer to cook with glass. And this way I can bake with them too. They can go straight in the oven, straight in the microwave, straight in the dishwasher, etc. And I took bookends and I lined them up along my refrigerator door. And these glass containers stand upright. So if you open my refrigerator door now, it looks like a bookshelf. And
It's
you can
amazing.
easily see all of the produce, all of my leftovers, anything that's going to spoil is filed away in that, little bookshelf essentially. So now when I go to cook, I know exactly what I'm looking at. When I go to grocery shop, I know exactly what we already have and what we need to supplement so
Need.
that I can use the products that are going to spoil. And those glass containers go back into their slots even when they're clean. So that now is also where they get stored. I no longer have to go to the cabinet to grab the thing, futz around with whatever else is in the cabinet. But I just open the fridge, I go straight to that spot, easy peasy. That one change has made such a difference in just the amount of joy I get when I open my fridge, first of all. And I think those little moments of joy versus frustration count a lot, especially if you have a lot of friction in your life because of ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
You're constantly upset, even in these little micro ways. And so shifting that into little moments of joy, I think make a big difference. I don't waste as much food. I don't spend as much on groceries. I feel good about myself because of those things.
And exciting and new. Like you're getting that dopamine
100%.
hit because you're rewarding yourself with this beautiful door that you've created
That's totally
with all your
functional.
food.
Yeah,
Yes.
I love it. It's aesthetically, my brain likes nice aesthetics, but it's also just so functional for me and my family. And I realized in that process that these little moments of friction, for example, like that might for someone else just be a 2-second detour, right? What's the big deal? Just go in the cabinet and grab the glass container from there. Yes, if that's all you're going to do, you're right. That only takes an extra, 5 seconds of time. But for me, I have a tendency I will open the cabinet and go to get the glass container and realize that they're not organized the way that I like, or they're not there and I have to go find it or whatever. And then the next thing I know, I'm reorganizing this entire cabinet while the fridge is still open and the food is still spoiling. And now I haven't made dinner and whatnot. So these little detours for me can turn into a cascade of events because of how inattentive and distractible I can be. So for me, eliminating even a small step in a process can make a huge difference because I stay on task. And so that one thing not only changed the game for me in that area of my life, my husband got it. So he then turned into just super enthusiast. He was someone who resisted organization as much as possible and thought that I was just being, trying to be a drill sergeant in my own home. And now he thinks it's brilliant how I've troubleshot all these things. So if you walk into my house, Tom will probably turn to you and say, "Hey, check out what Diane did with the fridge." Like he's become my cheerleader in all of these little
Aww.
things that I've done around the house, which means he also cooperates with the system and does it too, which is great. But it also, that other second piece allowed me to start troubleshooting so many other things where I thought, where is there an extra step where I'm getting derailed? And is there something small I can do to take that extra step out of the equation? And it's
Yeah.
changed I have so many little life hacks now that I also sometimes feature on my show in a segment called Macedo Methods, where, I have life hacks around packing now, which is like my kryptonite. Ugh. The way that I organize my makeup is different because I was forgetting steps in my skincare routine. And I realized if I put everything in a sequence of the way that I use them, I will just go through in the flow of movement and remember all the steps and stop forgetting to put on, my primer before I put on my foundation or whatever it is, which may sound stupid, but when it's something that you do every single day, those little things, having a moment of frustration almost every morning versus a moment of joy where you just think, look at how nicely my makeup's organized and you get to do it all fluently. It makes a huge difference in your day to day.
100%. The planning to plan everywhere in your life and being okay with that, because that does require some stopping and metacognition and thinking about what you want to do differently.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of being reactive to life, as many of us ADHDers are, right? Like Dr. Barkley said, where like we just follow things with our nose, whatever comes in front of us. Yep, that's it. That's it. That's it. Now you're actually being proactive and, like you said, creating less friction. So life is easier. And I love that, you're making that okay. And you're not shaming yourself and you're leveling the playing field. You're making life a lot easier and joyful, which I think is huge.
Totally. And it impacts how you view yourself. And it also impacts those around you directly in your orbit. One of the things my husband and I used to argue about all the time was I would leave the milk out and he would constantly ask me to put it back. But of course, it was in the middle of me doing 5 different things for our kids. And so I would snap back that I'm busy doing all these other things. Can't you just put the milk back? And he'd be like, listen, I'm not being unreasonable. Just milk will spoil if you leave it out. And so he took it as every time I left the milk out, it was because I didn't care and I was dismissing this is one of very few requests that he makes of me. And so he saw it as a slap in the face every time he saw the milk carton on the counter. And I saw it as, just a complete lack of understanding of where I was, that he walked into a room with, 1,000 things going on. And the one thing he chose to focus on was the milk. And then we'd get into, and now he realizes, oh, you left the milk out because you have short-term memory problems and you completely forgot about that milk the second you poured it for our kids. And you were probably pouring that milk for our kids in the middle of doing, 5 other things that you were trying to get done. So he is more sympathetic to me and more just sort of helpful in that line. And I also, now that I'm aware of why these things are happening, I'm not entirely sure why this happens, but I don't leave the milk out anymore. It's like as soon as I realized that it was a short-term memory issue and not just, that's what I do because I'm juggling a lot, I somehow that registered somewhere where now, as soon as I'm putting the milk down, I am able to trigger some mental note that says, no, don't put it down, put it away.
Well, our executive functions are completely tied to emotions, right? That are midbrain. So the fact that you and your husband are speaking more collaboratively and there's more love and there's more joy and more understanding probably gives you more space to understand the importance of putting the milk away, where before your brain was distracted.
Yeah, I think also as I'm saying it, I realize that one other thing that I've learned is to rely on my memory for nothing. And so anytime I have told myself I will remember to do that later, I now know better. Before I had this diagnosis, in my head, I was telling myself, I'll put the milk back in a second. Let me just do this other thing. And so I think now that I know that I cannot rely on my memory to remember to put the milk back in a second, I've stopped doing that. And I just say, no, let that thing I'm about to do wait and let me go ahead and put the milk back. So I think that's also been a huge help.
Especially with inattentive ADHD, we can only think about that one thing, right? And that's literally the thing that you have to keep telling yourself until you get it done. And as soon as there's an interruption or something else that happens, that one thing gets forgotten and you feel so shameful. So I love the Ohio method for that. You only look at it once, do it. If it's less than 2 minutes, get it done. So let's get into your sleep fix method. So I would love to know, as 2 women speaking to each other and a lot of women out there who have lots of hormonal stuff, ADHD, managing so much frontal load. Talk about your sleep fix method and how this is helpful for everyone and what you would also recommend for women specifically.
The background here is I struggled for years with insomnia, even before I had kids. And I would go to bed and I would try to sleep and I would stare at the ceiling and get frustrated and have this whole conversation in my head about how doomed I was going to be the next day because I wasn't getting my, recommended 8 hours. At the time, I wasn't even getting 5. I went to all of these, experts and whatnot. And the feedback I got was because I was working strange news hours. I was on an overnight shift at the time. I had just come off an early morning shift and so on, that, I was going to have to quit my job if I wanted to sleep well again. And I just thought, no, that's not going to happen. There has to be a better answer, right? Like police
Not all or
officers,
nothing.
firefighters, doctors, etc. Lots of people have to work strange hours, and the solution can't be that just none of those people can sleep. And so I started doing a lot more digging. I started reading a lot about sleep, and strangely, my sleep got worse because I started reading all these books about how important sleep was and how all of these repercussions if you don't get 8 hours and all the things you're supposed to do, sleep hygiene, etc., quit caffeine, stop doing this, no more screens in the evening.
So the
And
insomnia turned into more anxiety.
So I started doing all the things and my sleep got worse and worse and worse. And I just thought, what the heck is happening to me? I finally just said, forget it. I stopped reading, the bestsellers, and I stopped reading all the popular articles out there. And I instead started going to sleep medicine textbooks. And I bought a few books that were written by actual sleep clinicians. And I realized at the time I was doing a piece on this for ABC. I was the overnight anchor at the time. And so I told them, listen, I'm going to set out to fix my sleep. Do you want me to cover it? And they said, yes, please. And so I had set out to work with a sleep physician who tested me for sleep apnea. I had no signs of sleep apnea. And then I was supposed to go back and do some other test that was going to analyze my sleep cycles. And then from there, we were going to move on to what we knew at that point was an insomnia diagnosis. And I was going to start CBTI, which is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. That's the gold standard treatment for insomnia that for whatever reason, most physicians just, I don't know, don't tell people about. But because I was doing it for TV, I wanted to do everything by the book. So rather than jump right into CBT, I wanted him to do the sleep cycle test because I thought it would make for good television. And I wanted people to see that part of the process. But to be prepared, I went ahead and I started reading about CBTI so that when I started, I would know exactly what I was getting into. I would know the right questions to ask, etc. And in the process, I ended up fixing my sleep because it opened up this Pandora's box of interest for me. And I dove so deep into it. And I started implementing some of these really straightforward methods, rethinking the way I was looking at the problem entirely. And by the time he did that test, I was then getting 6.5 hours of high quality sleep in the middle of the day because I was still working an overnight shift. And I just thought, why isn't anybody talking about this stuff? Like I have spent 7 years of terrible sleep, doing all of the things everybody talks about doing. And in the end, the answer was in many cases the opposite of all of that. And so fast forward a few years later, I ended up writing my book because I started talking to a lot of clinicians who actually treat insomnia, sleep experts. And they were saying, yeah, this is what we see in our clinic all the time. And we've been trying to shout it from the rooftops and just nobody will listen. And so I decided to be a megaphone in many ways for that community. And in the process, I interviewed experts from all over the world, all different areas of sleep science. And I ended up putting it together like one big puzzle because there were some areas where this side wasn't necessarily seeing this angle of this side and so on. And so with my inch deep but a mile wide knowledge of this, I was able to put together some pieces where even the sleep experts who were so wonderful to work with me said, hey, I learned this from your book. I didn't even know that. And I've been a practicing clinician for, years or decades. So it was a really great experience, not only because it fixed my sleep, but being able to boil down all of this science into really easy to understand and funny stories and whatnot. The book is an easy read. And it's really prescriptive. So literally the number of people I cannot tell you who said, I was taking Ambien for years and I can finally for the first time sleep without medication thanks to your book. And, I have this woman, Pam, who writes me ever so often with a new update on the count of how long it's been since she took her last Ambien pill. And it's years at this point.
Wow.
So it was something where it was me paying it forward because I just felt like this stuff was so easy, so practical, and just the mindset shift changed so much for me that I need to get this message out there and needed to break it down into a really easy method that people feel like they can implement either with the help of their doctor or in some cases that they can do on their own, provided obviously their doctor says that it's safe for them to do it. It was a real game changer for me. And so I'm just hoping to do that for others. And now that I know I have ADHD, I'm like, wait a minute, that means these methods also work on people who have ADHD related insomnia because I didn't even know I had it. And obviously they worked on me. And so now I'm kind of delving into that area of things to see how it's all connected and see if there's a way that I can maybe do something that's even more specific for the ADHD community, because I know so many people think, oh, well, that's why I can't sleep because I have ADHD. And they just think they have to live like that. And they absolutely do not.
Yeah. So we know, yes, ADHD and sleep is completely interwoven with anxiety and thinking about the next day and restless leg syndrome and circadian
Which
rhythms
I have. Which I
and,
had.
right?
Check, check, check,
And
check,
our meds and
check.
all of the things. Give us some tools, because we know that, and people aren't going to like what I'm about to say, but we know that a lot of the things that work for us will also work for neurotypicals, right? It's just that we need them like more in most cases,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just like we experience the same emotions, but we just experience it more. So for the things that you have recommended to the general population, what would you say like the biggest, like your patients that, not your patients, but your readers who are no longer taking Ambien to go to sleep, what have they done differently?
Right. And to be clear, one, I'm not a medical professional. This is not medical advice. And I do not advise, if you've been taking sleeping pills, to just suddenly stop. That is a conversation to have with your doctor and preferably with a sleep clinician. But I do think it's interesting because, yes, those of us with ADHD often need these modalities even more. But I think sometimes making a slight shift in how they're implemented can make all the difference. So, for example, one of the big things you will hear both for ADHD and for sleep is to use meditation and mindfulness as a tool to kind of quiet the brain and quiet the mind and whatnot. First of all, quieting the mind is not a requirement of falling asleep. Nobody, I love the quote, you never stop thinking unless you're dead. So the idea that everyone else who sleeps well just shuts off their brain and goes to sleep and doesn't have any thoughts is a myth. And when we hold ourselves to that, we then get in our own heads because you think, God, I have to stop thinking, stop that, stop, quiet, stop thinking. And that obviously has the opposite effect. You just get more and more agitated and your mind races more and more. And for me, meditation kind of had that effect. I would do these meditations and I would just get in my head about how bad I was at meditation. And so, focus on the breath, focus on the breath. And I would focus on the breath for about 2 seconds. And then I would start thinking about that thing I forgot to do. And I have to remember and I have to go here. And then I have to stop, idiot, wait, focus on the breath, back to the breath, back to the breath. And 2 seconds later, I was off on some other tangent. And then again, reprimanding myself for not being able to just focus on the breath. And so for me, that experience of doing this thing that's supposed to be a calming exercise and works as a calming exercise for other people, for me was actually having the opposite effect. It was making me even more agitated. And so I would follow this meditation app, and then I would try to go to sleep. And I would fall asleep even later than I normally did, because now I'm going to bed stressed that not only am I a crappy sleeper, I'm also a crappy meditator. So I think it's really important to, one, find the thing that works for you, as cliche as that may sound. And for me, it ended up being this writing exercise. That's, in clinical terms, it's called constructive worry. I like to call it a brain dump, or I have a worksheet for it called the racing mind reset. And I sit down a little bit before bed, or I actually would do it in bed often because that's when I remembered to. So that was another ADHD adjustment I had to make, because often they'll tell you don't do it in bed, but I would forget. And then I'd get to bed, I'd be like, oh God, I didn't do my
I
thing.
gotta
So
do the
rather
thing.
than get in my head and yell at myself for that, I just started keeping the notebook in my nightstand. And I would sit up in bed on top of the covers, bed still made. And I would just do it right then, because my brain is smart enough to know the difference between I'm sitting on my covers and whatever, and I'm doing this thing, versus I'm in my pajamas, I've already brushed my teeth, I'm under the covers, lights out, right? One is sleep time and the other is work time. So, and I would do this practice, and it's, you just take a piece of paper, notebook, whatever, divide it down the center. And on the left-hand side, you just write everything that is on your mind. The kind of stuff that either wakes you up in the middle of the night or that you sit around thinking about when you're trying to go to sleep. And then on the right-hand side, you write down the very next step to resolving that issue. You don't need the ultimate solution. You just need the very next step. And this was huge for me for a number of reasons. One is that many of us are go, go, go all day. And anytime we're stuck waiting at a traffic light or waiting for an elevator or whatever it is, driving to work, we no longer just sit and think about and reevaluate our day, which is a completely normal thing for the brain to do. We occupy ourselves on our phone by doing something else. So often the only chance our brain gets to process our day and our thoughts and feelings is when we finally put the phone down and close our eyes and our head hits the pillow. So by kind of doing this exercise at this time, you are alleviating the need for your brain to do all that processing when you're in bed. Also, one of the keys to insomnia is when you spend enough time frustrated and awake in bed, your brain starts to associate bed with being the place where you go to be awake and frustrated. So this is something called conditioned arousal, and it's why people will often experience being drowsy and dozing off on the couch. And then the second you go to bed, you're suddenly all revved up and wide awake and you can't sleep. And you think, why? I was just falling asleep on the couch. It's likely because of conditioned arousal. You have spent so much time awake in bed that your brain has this autopilot feature for anything that's a pattern in our life. And your brain has learned that bed is a stressful place where we need to be alert. So instead of cueing your sleep response when you get in bed, your brain is cueing your fight or flight response. And now your cortisol is through the roof and you can't fall asleep. So by retraining your brain that this constructive worry time is where we do this kind of processing, your brain starts to learn, oh, this is where we worry and think about all of this stuff, not when my head hits the pillow. And then what you'll often find is you have repetitive thoughts in bed, and that's just a memory thing. If someone gave you a phone number that you couldn't write down, you would repeat the number to yourself over and over again. It's a natural way that humans remember things. So when we are trying to balance something in your head, and for ADHD, you're going to be more prone to this because we're so prone to forgetting things if you have inattentive ADHD, that we often will continue to repeat things over and over in our minds, which is just your brain trying to remind you to deal with that thing. It thinks it's being helpful. And so by writing all of this stuff down, you alleviate the need for your brain to continuously give you that reminder. And then finally, you actually rewire your brain. And you can speak to this better than I can, but by moving your brain patterns, instead of ruminating on problems, to focusing on the solution, because you're focusing on that next step to doing it, it changes the way you start to process your problems. And so the coolest thing about this is that you generally only have to do it for about 2 to 3 weeks, and then your brain starts doing it automatically. And for me, I noticed a difference not only at bedtime, but just throughout my day. I started encountering difficulties and immediately thinking, okay, what's the next step to resolving this issue? Instead of just, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening and I can't believe I have to do this. And what am I going to do about that? And just ruminating on the problem, I started just immediately shifting to solutions. And I think the next step portion of this is important for people with ADHD. And I think that's why this had such a big impact for me, because we have a tendency to get overwhelmed because we just see the gigantic task before us, right? It's problem, and then the next step is solution. And the path between the two can seem so large and like such a big undertaking that you get stuck in your tracks because you don't even know where to start. And so by rather than focusing on what the ultimate solution to the problem is, but rather just the next step, it could just be call Brooke because she knows more about that issue than I will. Call Brooke tomorrow. I'll write that in my notebook. Look this up on this website because I know they'll have more information. Like the tiniest little thing, you end up going to bed with this feeling of like, okay, I can do that. Like, even if I don't know what the ultimate solution is to this problem, I know that I can take 2 seconds and call Brooke tomorrow and ask her what she thinks. And that will move me along in the process. And so it gives you this feeling of, okay, I've done everything I can do about these things today. And tomorrow I have a plan that is doable for what I can do about them tomorrow. And now just recently, we came up with an addition. So I used to pick 3 things and advise people to pick 3 things that they will actually do tomorrow. So that can help you create a productive to-do list instead of having hundreds of things on your list, which I'm sure many of us can relate to. And now I even take it a step further and I pick what my one thing is going to be for the following day. So ideally, I still have my 3 things and I still have my full to-do list and whatnot. But rather than going to bed with this feeling of not enoughness, which I always had, because my brain, again, is an ideas factory. So I now know I will never be able to keep up with all of the ideas that my brain has. And that used to always make me feel like I hadn't done enough that day. Now, at night, I do my exercise, or sometimes I don't even do the full writing exercise, but I will think to myself, what is the one thing that I need to get done tomorrow? That if I do, tomorrow's a success. And I can now go to bed and sleep more easily because I got my thing done. And everything else that I got done was a bonus, rather than going to bed with this feeling of like, but I should stay up a little later and do these other things because I still have so much left to do on this endless to-do list.
Yes. I love that. The one thing, right? Obviously, there's a book about that, but I also talk about that 1% action, even during the day, right? Like, so do it at night, that first step. But when you're creating goals and actions, we get into this chaotic state again and we get into survival panic mode. If we could just think of that next step after a brain dump, like you were saying, then we can get momentum. And that momentum is going to give us clarity and confidence to keep going a lot easier. Even if it's so easy to you and your brain, right? Where it's like underwhelming, it ends up reducing your anxiety and creating a lot more space for you to continue to do the thing that used to be so hard to do.
100%. Often once you get started, you get that momentum going and then you're flying. And I think that's the part that a lot of people who don't have ADHD don't realize, is that it can be, I know there's a lot of debate over using this word, but I feel for me, it can be a superpower in many cases, because once I get going, one, the ideas that I come up with are really great. And I think ADHD is a large reason that I'm so good at my job as a news anchor, because I can think of questions to ask that others may not have thought of, or angles on a story that others don't see, and so on. In terms of the ideas, they can flow so well, and I think really outside the box compared to a lot of people in my orbit. But then also, once I get going on a project, I can sometimes accomplish what should be 10 hours of work in 1 hour. The downside is that there's the opposite. You get exhausted sometimes from that. And then you try to set out on what should be a really simple task. And you just think like, gosh, why can't I get these expenses done? And why is this taking me so long? And why do I keep losing focus every time I try to do this?
Yeah. And then it becomes an all or nothing mentality. Well, because I couldn't do my taxes for a year, I'm just a failure.
Right.
And I can't do anything. So now it's going to be 2 years later and I still haven't done my taxes. I'm just saying hypothetically, this happens to us, right?
And you're like, if I just need to gather the grocery receipts. Let me just gather those, or whatever, I just need to call the accountant and ask them what the first step is to do, or whatever it is. It then becomes that much more digestible. And so I think we often hear that as an ADHD tip, but it really works well in this context of doing this brain dump before bed too, because it for me, it has been a huge game changer, both in terms of sleep. And I realized now, in doing all this stuff to fix my insomnia, I was also doing stuff to help me manage my ADHD.
It's amazing. That's literally step one of my 12-step process too. Like brain dump and do one thing. I don't care what it is, but just take one step. That's all that matters. I love that.
So the other flip side to this is we all have a physical sleep drive, which is like hunger. So if you snack all day, you're not going to be that hungry for dinner. You might sit down, you have a little bit of your dinner, but then you don't have a full meal. And then maybe you wake up in the middle of the night and you're hungry or whatever. Sleep drive works the exact same way. So you talked about circadian rhythm. That's one part of our sleep system. Our sleep drive is the other part of our system. And so what we will often do is we will listen to advice like, if you're having trouble sleeping, just go to bed earlier so you can get more sleep, or to sleep in later so you can get more sleep, or to have a nap so that you can make up for that sleep loss. But it actually ends up having the opposite effect, because it's like you're telling someone, I think we think of sleep as if it's of insomnia, as if it's like sleep starvation, but it's more like when you don't have an appetite for sleep, right? If someone doesn't have an appetite at dinner, you're not going to be like, oh, what would help? Just have a snack. That's not gonna help. And so it's the same idea. So what we'll often do is we'll sleep in, nap, go to bed earlier because we're so worried about not getting enough hours. And we end up weakening our sleep drive, which just makes it harder to sleep against the following night. And you end up in this spiral because, on the one hand, all the agitation that's coming from those thoughts and worries that you have is revving up your wake drive. And now you're also lowering your sleep drive by doing all these things that you think are helping and that everyone always says to do, but they're actually hurting you. So often part of the solution when you have insomnia, which is you're going to bed, you're trying to sleep, you can't fall asleep, right? Different than not spending enough time in bed. The solution is actually to spend less time in bed, to go to bed later, which if you're an ADHDer probably sounds like, yeah, that I can do. I'm really good at that, right? But you keep waking up at the same time every morning and you stick to that. and you stop worrying about, but I'm not getting the 8 hours or whatnot, because we don't all need it. Everyone has a different amount of food to feel full. Everyone has a different amount of sleep they need to meet their sleep need. And eventually, by doing that and sticking to that pattern, you build up that sleep drive enough that by the time you go to bed, your sleep drive is high enough, even if your thoughts aren't completely quiet, because obviously they're never going to be. Your sleep drive is enough to overpower that. And then you start to build up sleep confidence. And now, instead of worrying before bed, which that worry in and of itself, the worry about not sleeping will cause insomnia. Once you feel confident that you know when you go to bed, you're going to fall asleep, it becomes more and more likely that it happens. And instead of being in this terrible cycle of sleeplessness where it gets worse and worse, you start to move that momentum in the opposite direction.
And accountability. And I see you're wearing your Aura ring. So having that accountability in seeing what you're doing. Are you looking at your Aura ring at all?
No, because sleep is not something we do. Sleep is something that happens to us. And once you try to force it to happen, it actually has the opposite impact. And so people were getting so in their heads trying to sleep or trying to sleep well, trying to get some percentage of REM sleep and deep sleep and whatnot, that they started actually to see their sleep decline. And so the reason I like the ring is that it's not shouting all these bells and whistles and notifications and glowing on my wrist. It's just there. And when I want to go back and reference something out of curiosity or look for a pattern, I can go ahead and do that.
So don't become so obsessed with the outcome.
Yeah. And even if you don't,
Just the
most of the
process.
information that it's going to give you is not going to be helpful information. You're much better off just keeping a sleep diary. And I have a list of suggested things to keep track of in your sleep diary, because that basic information that I give you, that's actually the kind of stuff that is useful for both you or your sleep doctor, if you are seeing a sleep, a sleep provider, to come up with a plan to actually help your sleep, because it will help you pinpoint what the root causes are of your sleep problems, as opposed to a fitness tracker, which is going to throw a ton of data at you that isn't really going to make a whole lot of sense. One of my friends called me up and started talking about his percentage of REM sleep and deep sleep and how it went. And I was just like, how is this helping you? What are you doing with that? Do you even know what that means? No, not really. Okay, so has it been helping you since you've been looking at it? No, I'm actually sleeping worse and worse the more I look at it. I was like, great, take it off your wrist, put it away, just keep track of these 5 things, and let's talk again in 2 weeks.
Awesome. Well, lots of really good information. And for someone who has a disability and is such a public face and voice, right? It just goes to show how many people still out there are not being diagnosed with ADHD. So even though it's rising, the people who are aware and the diagnoses, there's still a lot of people out there that don't know. So hopefully this episode brought some awareness to people out there. And if you are having trouble with your sleep, go get the Sleep Fix method. We'll put the link in the chat as well. And Diane, what's one thing that you want to leave our audience with? I always ask people at the end, and usually there's more than one thing that they share, and that's okay too.
I'm going to leave with the word disability, because I don't think it is. I think there are aspects of it that feel that way, and particularly because of the way we are expected to live. But I actually think it's just our brains are different. And I think, to the point you just made, I suspect the number is much higher than we think it is. And in sleep, I'll bring it back to that. People have different circadian rhythms. They're called chronotypes. When you talk about someone being a morning person, someone being a night owl, someone being, somewhere in between, we use those phrases as if they're choices, but they're not. Those are biologically dictated. Some people are biologically programmed to wake up early and go to sleep early. And some people are biologically programmed to go to bed late and wake up late. These things that were maybe considered disabilities or negative traits or whatever you want are actually just features of the way human beings survive in a different kind of community. And I think the more, again, this is not based on science, this is not based on journalism, this is just based on me and my hunch. I think we're going to start discovering that ADHD is just a different way that the brain thinks in order to suit different needs of our society. And maybe it's that, we are more visionary leaders and less good at things like cleaning our room, but almost every person who I know, who I've talked to about their ADHD, lacks in some area where they feel they are expected to perform in a certain way, but then they soar tremendously in some other area that maybe people just think is normal, right? I did well in school. I had lots of, you talked about my accomplishments. This brain has served me very well. And I'm not saying that to be egotistical, but I think everything that came really easy to me was really easy to dismiss because I just thought, well, yeah, I get good grades because I'm smart, and I do this because whatever, and I'm a good athlete because I'm coordinated. You don't think of those things. You only focus on the parts you're bad at, and you say, why am I so bad at this? I'm a failure. And so I think that I'd like to see the conversation shift a little bit, particularly in how we talk to ourselves about ourselves, to also talk about what this thing does for us, the way that our brain works and how beautiful it is in certain areas, and maybe forgive ourselves for the areas where it's not so great, and either find new ways of doing that thing that works with your brain, or if you have the means, to lean on other people to maybe support you in those areas so you can shine in your zone of genius.
I love that. Well, thank you again for your time. And I'm sure today's episode is going to resonate with so many people out there, especially those who are parents, late diagnosed, having sleeping problems. Where can people find you besides the news if they're looking for your tips?
So I am on Instagram and most social media at Diane R. Macedo. Specifically for sleep stuff, it's Sleep Fix Method. So at Sleep Fix Method on all social media, and that's where I post specifically just about sleep. Also sleepfixmethod.com. I have an online course you can take. I have a book, and I also do live events and live speeches where I go into companies and I teach people how to sleep, how to deal with their sleep problems, even if they have funky schedules or kids or all the other inevitable things that life will throw our way.
Okay, so I don't know when you actually sleep for someone who does all of these things, but apparently she knows what she's doing. So everyone go follow Diane Macedo on Instagram, on TikTok, go visit her website, her course, all of that. She's normalizing a lot of this for you and making you feel less alone and more joy with the positive aspects of your ADHD. So thank you again for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Successful with ADHD. I hope it helps you on your journey. And if you need any additional support for you or a loved one with ADHD, feel free to reach out to us at coachingwithbrooke.com and all social media platforms at Coaching with Brooke. And remember, it's Brooke with an E. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.